Well, hello. I'm Harvey Levinson, co-author of this book, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to introduce you to the chapter dealing with the history of graphic communication. It's quite a history. It's something that most people don't know about, and I hope that you find it intriguing and helpful in understanding the contents of this particular chapter. Let me start off by saying the story of civilization is the story of communication. This was noted in the industry's documentary called Harvest of Wisdom, The Story of Graphic Communications. And it starts off in Lascaux, France, between 15,000 and 35,000 years ago, when it is believed the first cave paintings were produced. Cave paintings, picture writing on stone, is thought to be the first form of graphic communication. However, it's believed that civilization was born when people started to write. And one of the first forms of writing discovered was known as cuneiform writing. Cuneiform was first developed by the ancient Sumerians of Mesopotamia around 3500 BC. The first cuneiform writings were pictographs created by making wedge-shaped marks on clay tablets with blunt reeds used as a stylus. This language further developed into characters that were brought together in a language such as we know today to create words and thoughts. Cuneiform and other similar languages that developed was instrumental in the development of papyrus, one of the first substrates known for the reproduction of graphics. And papyrus was also developed in the Middle East. After Egypt, Rome took the place of the world's major empire. The Romans knew that knowledge was power, and knowledge came from books. So developed some of the great libraries of that particular region. And Rome was the world's most powerful nation for 800 years. It took 2 centuries for Rome to fall in 410 AD, and this resulted from the invasion of the barbarians, and the Dark Ages begun. The Dark Ages represented many hundreds of years where little happened, except the slow rise to power of the medieval church. This lasted for about 1,000 years, during which people were ignorant. They could not read. There were no books. What did exist was destroyed by the barbarians, except in England. The church and the monasteries had books, which they saved over the years through rewriting by monks. Churches became powerful and helped preserve knowledge. People who wanted to learn came to the monasteries. Small schools eventually evolved in the churches, which later became some of the great universities. Hence begun the Renaissance. The rebirth of learning began. Enter Johann Gutenberg. Gutenberg did some of his famous work in circa 1456. That's when he printed the first, what's known as the Gutenberg Bible. Now, Gutenberg called his invention, artificial writing. We call it printing. Now, Gutenberg did not invent printing, nor did he invent movable type. What Gutenberg did, and most people are not aware of this, is he invented a process of duplicating movable type. Movable type was invented by the Chinese thousands of years before. But before Gutenberg, there was no way of taking one piece of movable type and faithfully reproducing it into as many characters as was desired. Gutenberg taught us how to do that. He was a metallurgist. He knew the difference between hard and soft metals. He knew about building molds and matrices and so forth. And through this knowledge, he developed a system whereby he was able to take one character of movable type, create a matrix, pour molten metal into a mold holding the matrix, and out came a piece of movable type. He could do this as many times as he wanted for any given character of type. One could say that because of Gutenberg, the printing industry developed. And in those days, when few people can read and there were few books, the printer became someone to be feared. The printer became dangerous and had to be controlled because of being able to print revolutionary ideas and have them read to the populace. Many printers were executed for printing things that were critical of those in power or represented unpopular opinions. Most violations had to do with statements regarding religion. And because of the press, freedom of religion developed. Without the printer, the Reformation might not have happened. To destroy a civilization, all one needs to do is destroy its printed records. This has been shown time and again throughout history as dictatorships developed around the world. However, the printing industry prevailed. In the 1500s, Juan Pablos came to Mexico and became the first North American printer, and Mexico became a printing center. 75 years later, a printer came to Jamestown, and in 1638, the first known printer appeared in Philadelphia. Ideas of most revolutions were expressed through the printing press. Before newspapers, there were town criers. Then newsbooks developed. News sheets became the first newspaper, and American newspaper printers broke new ground in freedom of the press. Freedom of the press became a reality, leading to the American Revolution. People started reading more, and then the telephone developed, typewriters developed, and photography followed. In 1890, the New York World was printed in color, the first color publication. In 1887, Mergenthaler invented the linotype machine, one of the greatest inventions of all times. Radio, television, and computer technology developed. Desktop publishing has increased the need for printing and made it more exciting. Gutenberg's invention made knowledge the property of all people who can read. Later on in the 20th century, lasers developed, microwave relays, cable communication, satellite transmission, microchips, and microprocessors, all of which further developed the technology used for printing and publishing. Computers and desktop publishing became everybody's business, regardless of who you are, regardless of the field you worked in, whether you were a student or a business person, whether you belonged to a nonprofit association or worked from the home. integrated circuits, transistors, microprocessors, and silicon chips made this all possible. Since the mid-1980s, nearly every piece of technology used in the printing and publishing industry are driven by microprocessors. Miniaturization took place. Cost reductions took place. Technology have given nearly every person access to printing and publishing abilities. The author of print can now be the producer of print. Since Gutenberg's work in 1456, technological transitions in graphic communication has taken less and less time. For example, Gutenberg did his work in 1456. That was over 560 years ago. In 1886, Mergenthal invented the linotype machine. That was 530 years later. But 68 years after that, in 1954, the Harris Corporation developed the first phototypesetting machine. And only 14 years after that, in 1968, Dow Jones was producing and distributing its newspapers via satellite transmission. That was the Wall Street Journal. 6 years later, in 1974, we saw the development of computer graphics on CRTs. That was produced by various companies in the engineering field. And 3 years later, in 1977, we saw the development of color monitors for transmitting data that was going to be used in printing. That was done by many companies. 2 years after that, the Cytex Corporation in Israel developed the first integrated system that combined different aspects of prepress into one operation. And 1 year later, we saw the Gannett Corporation produce and distribute printing via satellite transmission, but in this case it was in color, and that became the famous technology associated with USA Today. From that point on, technology accelerated at even greater speeds. Between 1980 and 1985, we saw government deregulation of telecommunication. That made telecommunication and satellite transmission available to all private companies that could afford it and get licenses to do that kind of work. Between 1985 and 1990, we saw the development of low-cost desktop publishing. And between 1990 and 1995, we saw the development and growth of multimedia. From 1995 to the year 2000, we saw the development and growth of on-demand printing, variable data printing, and digital color reproduction. In the early 21st century, we saw the diminishing of prepress. We saw web-to-print and print-to-web develop. We saw the growth of e-commerce, internet publishing, virtual reality, wetware. Wetware is producing microprocessors using organic components of the human body. We saw the development and growth of 3D printing. We saw the development of integration of prepress, press, and finishing in one operation, and cloud computing. By 2020, we expect to see wires that are 1 atom wide, memory cells of 1 electron, and unlimited memory and storage. Folks, this concludes an overview of this chapter, History of Printing. I hope by having heard the overview and by having read the chapter, your understanding of the important role of graphic communication in the production and distribution of knowledge has taken on a new meaning.